give it a few minutes for some folks to join, and feel free to add your attendance to the meeting. Yeah, we'll give it another couple minutes for some folks to join, and anybody who has joined recently, just feel free to put your self in the attendance there. All right, we can get started. For folks who are joining now, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting and anything that you want to add to the agenda. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Okay, so I know it's been a quiet few weeks. So let me start off. If anybody is sort of new to this meeting, who wants to introduce themselves, feel free to introduce yourself.
So hello, I'm Capos. I'm a professor at NYU and active in like tag security, tough in photo, things like that. But haven't been to this meeting yet, although some of you may have seen me other places.
Glad to have you.
Yeah,
hey, this
likewise.
is Matt. Oh,
oops.
Sorry.
No, sorry, Matt. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention real quick. Matt Speakerman with Dow joined the biweekly call yesterday, but this is my first time in this session in particular, so happy to be here.
Nice to see you again, Matt. Hi, I'm Trishank. Used to be Justin's student. Now I'm a Datadog security engineer there. I'm on the Salsa steering committee, like Michael, and I'm looking forward to joining these meetings. I kept missing it on the CNCF calendar, so here I'm finally. Great, thanks.
Yeah, just a reminder, this is technically under OpenSSF. I know that there's a lot of overlap between all the things, and there's 12 million calendars,
Right,
which is
right.
why, cool. All right. So next up, actually, is there anybody else? I think.
Yeah, hi, Sunny Yip here. I'm part of Kursari, and this is my first time attending the meeting. I'm looking forward to work with you guys. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, before we get into some of the things on the agenda, and sorry, I'm literally updating the agenda as we go along because there's a couple of things that came up yesterday in the SLSA meeting. But before getting into that, does anybody have any sort of updates from any tools that they're related to, or any of the things that we've been that are sort of related to the tooling and SLSA? Don't want to call on anyone, but I know Frederick, I know that I believe the NPM stuff was merged recently. Do you have some updates on that?
Yeah, so as you said, the RFC is now merged. So, but in practice, I would say it doesn't really change much. Like even if the RFC wasn't merged, we were sort of working on the details. So I don't really, I'm trying to think like if we can have something to share. I don't really think like the work is continuing to pursue as planned. So beyond that, I'm not sure. Like there are, of course, like slightly related to this, like work on SigStore.js and SigStore Tough and things like that that we're doing on, and hopefully can share back much more. Like SigStore.js is still in a good shape. Like it's, I mean, it's by far, or it's far from being complete, but it's sort of in a decent state. The Tough work is probably not yet open source, but it will be enough near future, like when we have a good working condition. There was some issues with the JSON canonicalization, like CJSON did confuse a few of the developers because after you canonicalize it, it's not actually proper JSON anymore. So, but yeah, we are aware of that, and we had got good feedback from Joshua Locke on that. So, but beyond that, I can't think of anything else really interesting to share. Like there are still, of course, some open details in terms of when the Salsa predicates are generated, like how they will be verified and to what extent, and how much will actually be in the hands of the downstream developers compared to how much will NPM itself actually try to verify beyond just making sure that the cryptographic material adds up. But there are definitely some ideas, and I know Vitze, who has been on this call before, has like a policy thing he's working on as well, which kind of relates to this, but is intended to be more, let's say, built on top of the capabilities that NPM itself have.
Cool. That makes sense. And yeah, I know the CJSON stuff is not the I've run into also some issues. I mean, I understand the goal, right? Because we want to make sure that the hash always remains the same of the content of the JSON, and so that there's some way to kind of do that.
Yeah, I think parts of what's very confusing is that the CJSON spec itself is contradictory. It says in the human readable text, like this will produce perfectly valid JSON, but then when you look at the formal specification, it's obvious that the result will not be JSON parsable. So I think that has led to some confusion.
Yeah, that might be worth bringing back up to, actually, I'm not 100% sure who is in charge of CJSON.
I don't know, but at least Joshua kind of immediately identified this as the root cause and pointed to the spec and some other related issues I think it's in Python Tough.
Yep.
Sorry, just to, I think, you know, a few of us here are Python tough folks, at least Justin, Sebastian, and myself. Maybe we can help with this. Sorry, can you give a specific example of how CJSON makes it invalid JSON? Do you mean like the new line escapes and public keys?
Yeah, I think at least new lines, that's the thing I remember.
Yeah, that's definitely.
I can't remember if it was only for the public keys, but yeah, definitely that's the thing that broke some things.
Gotcha. Is there anything that we can help with? Maybe clarify things in the spec?
I think, I mean, I can't remember the details. I can probably dig it up, but Joshua linked to an issue in Python Tough that pretty much was running into the same issue. So yeah, if it's if it's clear in, let's say, the Tough specification that when you're looking at, I don't know, the CJSON spec, because I think CJSON is not related to Tough at all. It's just
No.
shows a canonicalization format. So just beware that the spec might be hard to read.
Okay, I'll create an issue in the spec. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool. So is there anybody else who's been working on any SLSA tooling, whether it's something that is, well, yeah, has anybody been working on any sort of SLSA tooling or related to SLSA tooling that they want to bring up as an update? Okie dokie. So next up, one of the things on the agenda, which was brought up yesterday, was the desire to have a verifier. And I know we have a verifier, but to make sure the verifier that we have for SLSA specification. Hold on, let me bring this up. Let me fetch this, the link to this. There is this tool, and I'll post it here as well as in the meeting notes in a second. But one of the ideas was we want to make sure, you know, as we are pushing for 1.0, we want to make sure we have some set of tools, libraries, services, etc., that can verify SLSA attestations. And I think that, just to be clear, I think that there's stages to this, right? Because I think there was some confusion yesterday. Like some of it is just literally, because this is actually a common issue among some of the SBOM stuff today, is a lot of folks are actually not generating SBOMs that are valid to the spec. So it's not even just about verifying like, hey, is this signed by the right parties? Is the build content, like, is the content inside there correct? And could I like generate a new build out of this sort of thing? It's beyond that. It's more of like, does it even match the spec at all? Which is a fairly common question, especially as we sort of drive to 1.0, making sure that different tools can verify, different tools support the different specs is going to be important. And today, we don't really have like a SLSA generator / verifier library for any sort of major language outside of, if you look at some of the SLSA verifier stuff, it uses the Intodo libraries and then adds some stuff that it just looks for SLSA on top of it. But what would be nice is to be able to sort of say, hey, if we have something like a JSON schema or whatever as the canonical representation of SLSA 1.0 spec, we want to be able to go back to it and say, okay, great. Everything should be able to, you know, like Python, JavaScript, Go, whatever should all be able to point to that schema as the thing to then sort of use as a verification, used for sort of, I don't want to say verification, maybe that's a bad term, validation, that making sure that it's actually valid salsa. Does that make sense to folks?
Yes.
Yep. So stage one is ensuring that the content of the salsa attestation actually complies with the specification of the predicate definition. Specification of the predicate.
So it's basically a schema validation, right? This whatever.
Yep.
It's not the content inside the schema. We are not validating the content.
Yeah, at least not yet. That's, I think, like what I would say is like stage one, right? Is just essentially doing that, because that sort of thing is complicated, because we already sort of discovered early on a bunch of bugs, for example, in Tecton chains that we had to fix, where Tecton chains was, I think, one of the fields was supposed to be a URI and it was just a plain text. So stuff like that was just needs to kind of be sorted out, because we're already seeing this in like the SBOM world a lot. We're seeing this a lot in the SBOM world, where like something generates an attestation, generates an SBOM that's like 90% valid, and certain languages, or sorry, not certain language, but certain implementations, I should say, of that can read it no problem, because they're a little bit less rigorous. But for example, a lot of the other ones, like especially those in more stricter languages like Rust, tend to sort of complain, because it's like, hey, yes, you're 90% compliant with the SBOM spec, but actually the SBOM spec says you need to have a SHA-1 hash, not just, you know, you can't replace SHA-1 with SHA-256. You need to, it can only be complementary. So there's things in the SBOM specs that kind of talk about that sort of thing, and there's stuff that's going to be also in the salsa specs that talk about that sort of thing. And we've been seeing a lot of that kind of get really complicated. So it would be really great to be able to say, point to something, whether it's a JSON schema, whether it's a queue definition, whether it's some other sort of way of defining, you know, something that's like, even something like protobufs, if you could include some additional data types in the protobuf or something like that, some way of just sort of being able to say, yes, this field must be a URI, and this field must be a string of length, you know, 20 or whatever it is. And that you can then, you know, you could then just sort of take that schema and plug it into whatever language you want, and you automatically get that validation piece, so that you don't have to worry about the different implement. Because we're seeing this a lot in a lot of the tooling, is we're seeing, you know, somebody somebody puts in most of the salsa stuff but forgets one thing or another, and so people will say, hey, it verifies in the Go implementation, but not the Rust one. And part of that is like, oh, well, the Go one ignores errors, the Rust one doesn't. And you're like, okay, great. You know, so it becomes this big mess.
Yeah.
And then stage two, as some folks were saying, sounds like it might be something along the lines, is verifying signatures on the salsa attestation envelope. So, you know, most of it right now is obviously using Dizzy, but the basic idea, I think, that some folks have said is like, hey, great, we want to be able to go in and say, let's verify the actual signatures, and that's kind of what the verifier is doing as well right now. There's also, and I don't know if this is, you know, once again, I'm just kind of rattling out what were sort of the thoughts in my head. But some folks have also said, okay, cool. Now, one of the other things is like, maybe this is stage 3 or maybe this is stage 2. I don't know which one we want to kind of call this, but is actually, you know, is inspecting the inspecting the values in, or expecting the content inside of the SLSA attestation. So like actually looking, does, you know, does the, give me 1 second. So like stage 3 is potentially something like actually inspecting the content. So looking at the actual values of inside of the, like the key values inside of the predicate, and actually saying, yes, this matches some sort of policy. Like, yes, this, we only allow these build type URIs for our policy. Cool. Oh, I just realized some folks have their hands up. Frederick?
Yeah, just one minor comment, like, wouldn't we want to switch stage 1 and stage 2? So we only parse it and verify the schema after we have verified the signature. Like, let's say there could be an attack against the parser and we don't want to potentially parse untrusted data.
Yeah, so maybe this is, I agree that, so maybe it's better to kind of say, like priority 1 might be something like just verifying that the content is correct, like, because that's just gonna be the easiest thing that we can do, right? Where that's gonna be something that's sort of different from necessarily just the trust element, because some of the stuff is just gonna be, hey, people are gonna be using some of the verifier stuff to help, I don't, I'm gonna say, like, I'm gonna use this word, but I don't actually mean it in the way I'm gonna say it. Like, be able to certify the tools to say, are you actually generating valid SLSA? Or, you know, can you check that you're actually validating valid SLSA? So I agree that that probably makes sense to switch. I was just kind of talking about it more from the perspective of maybe even a prioritization, like, yeah, like step 1 is we should probably make sure that it is 100% valid SLSA. And then step 2 is let's, you know, make sure that the signature stuff is all implemented and that we're, you know, able to use SigStore and whatever other major signing mechanisms we might be using, and then and so on. Cool. Trishak?
Yeah, that's a good comment about the parsing untrusted payloads. I think that's partly the problem that DISI was designed to solve for. Yeah, with things like canonicalization JSON, canonicalize, whatever, you get the idea. But the problem with CJSON is you have to parse it first just to be able to verify the signature, whereas with DISI, you don't have to do that. So that should go a long way. And then you can, once the signature is legit, then you have a lot more assurance that, okay, I can at least begin to parse this signed payload. The question I had for you, Michael, is where does the policy come from? Sorry, didn't mean to catch you off guard. Oh, Michael, sorry, I had a question for you. Where does the policy come from? Is it like a prescribed format? Maybe I missed something? No, hold on.
So I apologize. Something just happened and my headphones just died on me. Like, so I don't know. I didn't catch the last maybe 15 seconds of what you said.
Gotcha. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. So the question I had for you is, where does the policy come from? Is there like a separate SLSA thing that I might have missed?
No. I think the idea here is so the SLSA verifier that folks are looking at, and so there's a bunch of different discussion about what this might end up looking like. And you know what the actual policy might be, and if there's going to be using like a policy engine or whatever. But I think some of the content is just like, could you use something like JSON path like things to just sort of say, great, does this match? Like, I'm expecting stuff to look like this inside of the inside the attestation. And so it could just be something as simple as like a YAML file with some elements in it, or that's sort of, I think, a little bit much more up for discussion. But yeah, that's one of the things that that we're like looking at, but this is more right now, at least like conceptually, it's like, hey, we do want to eventually have some sort of mechanism, and this is something that this is part of stuff like the policy, like a combination of like tooling and libraries, right? Because we might want to include the ability to sort of say, hey, here is a way to apply policies to IT6, right? Yeah.
Just to clarify, just to follow up on that, and then I'll yield to Aaron. Wasn't there some work that Mark and friends were doing to try to prescribe more formally a policy?
That I'm not sure. They maybe. I know that there's some discussion about post 1.0, the semantics around some of these things of just saying like, hey, great, now that we have 1.0, how should people be interpreting, or not interpreting, how should people be using the different pieces of content inside of the attestation? So this might be something like, hey, your build config should be thought of as, you know, the inputs to the build or whatever, you know, your build script or whatever. And so it should be thought of like that. So if you have a policy around build config, that's how it should be interpreted. And then, you know, certain metadata about timestamps should be like, oh, this is the timestamp of when the build was recorded to have started and the timestamp of when the build was, you know, found to have stopped. That sort of thing. Aaron?
I was just gonna circle back and kind of comment on the conversation around, you know, this idea of the metadata verifier tool that we're talking about. Sounds like we're gonna build it from the ground up, right? And my opinion, from like a phase 1 versus phase 2 perspective, is, you know, I think phase 1 should honestly be a schema validator. It's not as valuable from a security perspective for the end user, but it actually is valuable from a utility perspective for, you know, the ecosystem of builders and the ecosystem of consumers, right? To make sure that these things are actually being generated from these tools and builders the right way. You know, Frederick, I think you made the point to like, maybe we should prioritize validating the authenticity of the thing first, but I think from a utility perspective and kind of like offering this for like value to the community from a valuable perspective rather than a security perspective, I promote kind of what Mike has been talking about for validating the schema first as like a first win, I'd say. But I think it's still really valid, right, to make sure it is authentic, of course.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. And just to be clear, I think it's less about the right, like if you're talking about it conceptually, imagine you had a 100% finished product. It probably would look something like, you know, first you check the signature, then you verify that it's actually valid schema, right? And then, well, actually, you'd probably first check, like, is it a valid envelope? Then you check the signature, then you check the if the content's valid. And this is, to be clear, this is stuff that we're actually currently doing in stuff like WAC. Already. The thing that I think we want to be able to do, though, is we would much rather have some of this be included in libraries and other tooling so that we can call out to that other tooling, and as opposed to like one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is, and I know that this is kind of you know, par for the course a little bit with Go, is that it's so easy to sort of re-implement stuff in Go, is that everybody just sort of, as opposed to writing a lot of the shared libraries, they just sort of say, great, yeah, I'll just write a quick, you know, 50-line thing that just kind of will parse through my pieces that I need. The problem that we're sort of seeing, especially in the SBOM space and starting to see a little bit with the SLSA space, is as folks, if folks are not using some of the existing sort of libraries out there, and they sort of just build out their own thing, and they just sort of say, yep, I'm expecting to see JSON, or I use the Dizzy stuff, and then I get a base 64 encoded content. I, then turn it into JSON, and then, pull it into my local thing. And I just have some structs for the content that I want. What we're seeing is some people are already building out policy and doing certain things against SLSA attestations that aren't actually valid SLSA. They just look like valid SLSA, so that as soon as
as soon as they start to push it to another tool, that tool like will complain and they go, wait a second, this tool doesn't complain. And I know that that's more of a community problem, but it would be great to sort of say, you know, hey, there is this SLSA verifier, which, just to be clear, I think most of this content should go into the SLSA verifier, and maybe we might want to abstract the SLSA verifier into a library plus the tool. But the SLSA verifier, if I can scroll back up here, that's linked in the document, and I'll just put it in the chat just so that folks can click on it. This SLSA verifier is, you know, a CLI. There's a bunch of stuff in here. There's a bunch of you know, stuff in here for actually, you know, verifying different elements, yada yada. I think, you know, for folks who are building their own tools, it'd be great to be able to say, hey, great, I can include the library pieces of this into my tool, so I don't have to call out to the CLI. But, you know, having a lot of this in here would be really great. Separately, one of the things that was talked about yesterday in the conversation was in the SLSA meeting was Laurent said it might also make sense to run something like this for a while as like as a public API kind of thing. Because a lot of people, you know, as something that somebody can just sort of say, hey, I'm going to send this over to some, you know, to some API, yada yada, so that folks don't have to run it themselves. I'm a little ambivalent on one way or the other. I'm sure it comes with its own pros and cons, because now you're trusting some third-party service to essentially verify that. But yeah, that's kind of where we landed with that. And I'm trying to think if there is, was there anything else from like a stage 4 at this point? I don't think so. I think that was kind of the main stuff, was just, you know, verifying signature, verifying that it actually matches the spec, and then saying, hey, can you validate the content against some sort of policy. Any other thoughts, questions about any of that? All right. Cool. So, and let me oops. What are the other topics I think that's going to be coming up based on some of the SLSA conformance work is what sorts of builders actually conform to the SLSA specification, especially as we are driving towards 1.0. Some of this is going to start becoming a bit higher priority because a lot of folks are obviously, you know, there's a lot of confusion about like whether or not certain types of builds might meet certain types of SLSA specifications. There's going to be, for folks who aren't familiar with the SLSA conformance work, most likely there's going to be, so there's going to be a conformance program that most folks can self-certify, but it comes with, you know, some requirements, right, where you are essentially asserting that you're following certain rules. And, you know, if you're found to not be following those rules, you'll be asked not to say you're complying to SLSA. And the reason being is, you know, obviously with the OpenSSF and Linux Foundation is they don't want just everybody under the sun saying, yep, I'm SLSA level, you know, 12, right? Because that sort of dilutes the brand and then and makes it sort of worthless. At the same time, they don't want to sort of enforce that, you know, every single person needs to go and work with some audit firm or some security firm to sort of verify that they're actually following all the SLSA rules, right? For certain companies that might make sense. And, especially folks who might say, hey, yeah, we've been certified by some big security vendor or audit firm. And yes, they've sort of verified that we're doing everything SLSA 3 and yada, yada. That's great. But there might be some self-certification there. And most likely there's going to be self-certification, or sorry, there's going to be certification on, or self-certification on a couple of different things. One of those things might be the actual builders themselves, so that the open source builders, like for example Tecton and Fresca and Jenkins and Circle CI and GitHub Actions and whatever, might all be able to come in and say, okay, great, we are doing, we can release a document that says we are doing these things, and based on that you can go and say, great, that sounds good to me, and yes, you're complying, but as an end user, I trust that, or whatever. So that's one of the things that's coming down the line, and it's something that we probably want to look at, especially as some folks have sort of brought up, like there's been some challenges with certain build systems and hitting some of the higher level SLSA stuff, at least out of the box, right? Like, because one of the big ones is like Jenkins is relatively open out of the box. You can do a lot of things and add a lot of plugins to then make it easier to comply with SLSA. But I think there's going to be some discussion about, hey, could we write up something if somebody is is doing a lot of stuff with, let's say, Jenkins right now, could they write something up to say, hey, here's how we're currently trying to hit all the SLSA requirements via something like Jenkins. Some of the other ones might be a little bit easier because they're kind of like locked down by default and stuff like that, or stuff that's like more declarative, like Tecton and whatever. But that's just something to kind of think through. And does anybody have any thoughts on sort of that like builder certification process or anything like that?
Yeah, we were working on a solution that kind of is more of a management console that'll allow you to pull in, create a end-to-end CI/CD type of solution and discuss, run the attestation through the existing, provenance checkers and things like that, and looking at where the gaps were to get, level 1 through 4. Some of the discussion points, we've had are, how do you do this with multiple different tools who handle these different ways? The plugins, as you mentioned, is one conversation point. But, going for each phase of SLSA and having to do multiple scans to determine, are you still compliant? The code signing aspect of it for one thing, right? Have you signed it? Have you checked it again? Are the repository aspects correct? All of the various different stages of the SLSA component at each stage in the SDLC is something that we're still trying to kind of ideate solutions around. And I don't think you can do it simply with just the single CI/CD component because of all of the plugins. And as you start to think about different things like vulnerability versus configuration checks versus other aspects, it really becomes a third-party tool that either needs to be injected to look for specific components, or more of an overarching kind of tool that allows you to plug in your CI/CD into it and manage this process for you, is kind of the direction we were thinking. I can't see a universal way to do all 4 stages in Jenkins, for example. It might be more possible in some of the more proprietary ones if they dedicate the time and effort to it. But in the more open source type of tooling, I don't know that that's enough of a focus yet from a lot of the communities. So it definitely needs to be. But it becomes that kind of broad conversation of, should it be more of a facaded management console that does this and can be flexible enough to incorporate different CI/CDs? That'd be something I bring to the community. Is it worth the effort to start a project that builds something like this in the community? I think it is, but that becomes a conversation for, who'd be interested in working on that type of project. Because it would be, starting off with something like a Jenkins, and then, bringing in Tecton and Tecton chains, and bringing in, all the others, the GitLab CIs, the Travis CIs, and X, Y, 1 to N other components as time goes by. But that's kind of the high level ideation and discussions we've been having on this topic.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. No, definitely agree with you there, Eric, especially on that one point you had about like, it's more than just the CI tool, right? Because, you need to include, scanners and whatever else. And I think one of the things that has been sort of brought up, previously as some, and this might be something that this team maybe wants to kind of discuss a little bit, is like, what is the responsibility of the there is I'm going to say that there's like probably a set of tools, right, that help here, and then there's also a set of elements regarding how your flow goes, right? Whether your CI pipeline works, right? Whether it's encoded in Tecton or in an Entoto layout or whatever. I think that there's things here where you kind of come in and say, there's certain elements of the builder, right? And so let's just say, for the sake of argument here, like you're using build packs. Hey, there's certain things build packs can do for you, but it doesn't, like build packs itself doesn't provide any guarantees as far as like the orchestration of the pipeline, so how it got there, right? So it doesn't, build packs itself doesn't really have mechanisms to say, hey, in another isolated environment, run, this scan, let's say, right? But, Jenkins or Tecton or whatever, GitHub Actions has that sort of ability to say, hey, run build packs followed by run this scan. And then each of the, so that's like two elements. And then the other element is the actual sort of pipeline itself, right? So something like Entoto layouts or Tecton or Jenkins file, you want to make sure that those things are structured such that you are enforced, you're forced to run the right things to hit the right stuff, right? Because depending on the different CI tools, if you do not use, like if your GitHub Actions or whatever do not use the salsa generator, then you're not generating salsa provenance. And so what sorts of things can you do to essentially enforce that is also important.
Well, yeah, and I'd take that a step further to say that there needs to be, how Jenkins will provide you some limited type of reporting on the fact that you've run certain jobs and everything else. You need to have some sort of metrics and reporting structure that shows, that you've actually attained, this project is actually validated for salsa level 1, level 2, what have you, and a history of that, right? So it was compliant. Now it's not on a given time frame. That type of, and at what stages, potentially, like it passes, the first 5 bullets of salsa, but the next several it doesn't. So we know provenance wise based on that and where the gaps are. What are you missing to be fully salsa compliant? Those are the types of things down the road that definitely need to be included, so that projects can, it's a kind of a question now as to how valid badges are and things like that. Some people think they are. I think they're very valuable, but I think, if you can provide, hey, my project is, salsa level 3 compliant as a badge or something on your project because it's run through all of these gates. When somebody goes to pull down your binary, That's to me, that's a pretty good indicator that your project is secure. So, some things to think about, but I definitely think that we have to talk more about, the metrics and the observability of this process too, not just, becoming capable, but how do we prove that, and how do we show over time that it's remains compliant.
Parth?
Yes. So what I was trying to say, what I wanted to say is, in the certification process, it seems like it would need to be a continual process, right? It's not like a one-off kind of thing, depending on the build system, right? If it's something that people can, if it's based off multiple components, and if someone goes in and changes something, right, that the whole certification kind of goes away, right? So it seems like it needs to be some kind of an automated way of continuously validating that it's in the right step. And I think that's what Eric is kind of referring to. But I'm just wondering if that's even possible with so many components out there and such. So
yeah, so this was something that's also been discussed a little bit with the conformance program, is like certain things might be able to say, hey, look, we're gonna, yes, somebody could be messing with the pipeline right after we got the certification. But if you are continuing to do some of this, like if you're, let's say, once every 3 months, 6 months, a year, or whatever, it might get caught. And then also from the policy standpoint of the organization that's consuming it, they might want, more or less of these things. They might want increased sort of verifications. And then the other thing, right, is the idea, at least behind some of it, at least for organizations, right, like folks who, I want to say is it's not just an open source project that, like, hey, Mike, made a little, toy project and he added some salsa to it, and, said, yep, everything's good, and then changed stuff and never updated it again. Like, I think that sort of thing is very much going to be dependent on the organization consuming it to say, hey, maybe I don't trust a project that is just run by a single person. But certain other organizations who have a lot to lose, whether it's money, reputation, whatever, if it turns out a third-party audit firm does come in and say, hey, you're, a lot of this stuff should show up. And also, if it turns out you're lying, a lot of your customers are probably going to sue. So I think that kind of thing is also, I think, a risk there, which is why I think a lot of folks are, when it comes to some of this self-certification, a lot of those things can, and I think have been seen to be sort of legally actionable. If it turns out like, yeah, I certified this thing and then immediately changed it afterwards. But I think it's going to be that balance. And then especially in the open source space, I think we're going to have to see, perhaps larger organizations like your Microsoft, your Googles and Red Hats and VMwares or whatever, to sort of say, hey, we looked at this open source tool and we've looked at what they've been doing, and we've looked at their self-certification and sort of revalidated it, and we think, yeah, seems to be the right sort of thing. I think that's going to be another way they might go about that.
Right. Makes sense.
Cool. Any other thoughts about like builders and certifications and whatnot? And I know I know Fresca is working a lot on this in the open source space, right? This is, I think, to go back to what Eric was talking about, is, Fresca is trying to be that opinionated set of tools plus the pipelines themselves to try and say, hey, in order to actually comply with a high level of SLSA, you don't get to define your own pipeline that lets you ignore these things. We are essentially saying your pipeline is actually constrained to run certain sorts of actions. With that comes, a lot of folks probably don't want to use that because they say, hey, we want to run our own custom thing. Okay, great. But I think Fresca is trying to kind of do that sort of thing. And I think we're trying to look at like, how easy is that to certify? And I think that there's some stuff there. And if folks are interested, we're obviously looking for more contributors on that one. It's an OpenSSF project. But anyone else have any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, we can kind of go on to the next quick sort of topic, which is sort of related to the past two ones. All right. So one of the other things, which is related to the two previous ones a little bit, which is this idea that Santiago from Intoto and Purdue University had brought up, is this idea of a predicate dictionary. So if this is for going back a little bit, so SLSA is, for folks who aren't super familiar with Intoto, is SLSA attestations, the predicate format, which is the JSON format, right? That is being heavily recommended for use for SLSA. You don't actually have to use it to be compliant with SLSA, but you know, pretty much everybody is using, anybody who's using SLSA is more or less using the Intoto predicate format. There's some talk about perhaps building some tooling, a library to sort of help with the mapping between SLSA, or not just SLSA, but we'll use SLSA as an example, but SLSA and other predicate formats, mapping to internal data models or mapping to an ontology and then to it an internal data model, which would allow for a lot of tools to just ingest from the predicate dictionary and be able to automatically at least get some ability to sort of parse through a SLSA attestation. It might not be able to get all the semantic information that you might want, but it in the very least could do stuff like verification. So the idea would be something like, just thinking about this is conceptually, you have a set of JSON schemas or a set of Q definitions or some sort of way of saying, hey, I have, this is how, this is some sort of schema. And then you might have one or more mappings to either a data model or to an ontology that, you know, says like hash equals checksum in this data model, or hash equals, you know, and that could be itself another schema, something that is not like code per se. It's just something like a JSON document, an XML document, some sort of parsable thing, which would allow different tools to be able to just say, great, I can just include a new, if a new version, a new minor revision that doesn't really modify how how the attestation should be interpreted, more of just like some clarifications or some extra elements here and there. You can have ways to say, great, this, like we now support, some new hashing format. Okay, cool. That just sort of maps into this internally, into some internal data model or into some other ontology. So that's just something else that's being discussed as a way to kind of make it easier for folks to adopt this. Thoughts? Does this sound something that is interesting to folks, or anything like that?
Yeah, I think this would be great. Having this, being some kind of language agnostic type that we can use to, validate and do enforcement of the schema and so forth. I think it'd be very, very useful. I mean, I did want to hear your concerns, if we have time, but like in terms of the protobuf, I think maybe that might be a good thing to discuss, the actual format type and stuff.
Oh, yeah. I think when it comes to the serialization, I think it doesn't matter. Like for me, whether it's JSON, protobuf, whatever, I think the thing that a lot of folks have, I myself have concerns with is you want to have more information about the actual schema, right? Because like protobufs has fairly, has whatever a dozen or so types, int 32, int 64, or whatever, stuff like that. But it doesn't have stuff, and it has stuff I think also like timestamps, but it doesn't have, for example, things like URI validation, right? And you probably want to be able to say this should be a valid URI. In certain contexts, you might say, oh, this should be a name that's no longer than 64 characters or whatever, right? And it's the sort of thing that kind of goes beyond what the protobuf can do. It's stuff that like I know JSON schema can sort of do with some things, and I know that's something that QLang is able to do as well. And so I think that sort of thing is kind of what we're sort of looking at as a way of sort of then being able to say a predicate, any sort of in toto predicate could be, okay, cool, this is the URI. This is like, for example, this might be even another subtype, right? People have talked about, okay, cool, could we have something like subject inside of in toto be a type itself? And then you can say, okay, great. Or something like name plus hash is some sort of type or whatever. And then you can then inject that in other places, so that the way that it gets parsed automatically gets parsed the same way, instead of having to kind of duplicate a lot of that work all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's happening with the digest set. I think that's part of the subject. Something happening there a bunch of times. So
yeah. Cool.
So is it a thought process, especially for the SLSA? Is it going to be both Q and protobuf, or is it still in works?
Still in the works, and I think that the idea here is just to also make it very easy for like even some of the tools to not have to really update their code in order to, like, you don't have to download a new version of the code in order to figure out the schema. Like, because one of the reasons, right, in toto attestations and all those things are URIs, is eventually they should be actually resolvable, so that you could go back and actually pull down the definition from the URI. And then from there, you should be able to say, okay, great, I can pull this down. And if you had something like a predicate dictionary, okay, check the predicate dictionary or have different predicates registered with your dictionary or whatever. And that should have some sort of mapping mechanism to your internal data model, or preferably one day, and I know this is a pipe dream, but you could have something where it's, it maps to an ontology, and then you could have that two-way sync where you can say, great, I can now convert, if I have enough information in SLSA, I can convert SLSA to an SBOM and an SBOM to some of the elements that I need for SLSA or whatever. Cool. Any final thoughts about this or any other topic? Anything that folks wanted to bring up for next week? Any demos or anything like that? Cool. If not, everybody can take back 2 minutes and please put stuff on the agenda for next week. Oh, actually, no, sorry. Probably cancel next week since it's the day after the US Thanksgiving holiday and a lot of folks usually have off. Yeah. So I'll get back to you about whether or not it's canceled. I'll see if there's still interest from folks. But yeah, cool. Talk to everybody soon.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye.
Later.